I'm Amber, 28, and this is the story of how I learned that success has a way of revealing people's true intentions, especially when those people are supposed to be your family. Before I go deeper into my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. If you've ever stood your ground when someone failed to see your worth, feel free to let me know below. And if these kinds of stories speak to you, you're welcome to follow the channel for more. Growing up, I thought I had the perfect family. We were the Martinezes who gathered every Sunday for my mother's famous enchiladas, where my father would tell stories about building his construction business from nothing. And my 3 siblings and I would argue about everything from politics to who got the last piece of flan. We were tight-knit, or so I believed. My parents, Maria and Roberto, had immigrated from Mexico in their 20s, working double shifts to give us opportunities they never had. They preached about family loyalty, about how blood was thicker than water, about how we would always have each other's backs no matter what. I was the middle child, sandwiched between my older brother Miguel, who followed Dad into construction, my sister Carmen, who became a nurse, and my younger brother Diego, who was still finding his way through community college. I had always been different from them. While they were content with stable, traditional paths, I was the dreamer, the one who spent hours sketching app interfaces in my notebooks during family dinners, talking about changing the world through technology. After graduating with a computer science degree, I spent 5 years climbing the corporate ladder at a major tech firm in Austin. I had a corner office, a 6-figure salary, and what everyone considered the American dream my parents had sacrificed so much for. But something was missing. Every day felt like I was building someone else's vision, contributing to someone else's legacy. The entrepreneurial spirit that ran in my family's blood was calling to me, whispering that I was meant for something bigger. When I first mentioned starting my own company, my family was supportive, even excited. Dad would pat my back and say I had inherited his business instincts. Mom would brag to her friends about her daughter, the successful engineer who was going to be her own boss. Miguel would joke that maybe I'd hire him to build offices for my future empire. Carmen would tell her nursing colleagues about her sister's brilliant app idea for healthcare coordination. Even Diego seemed proud, telling his friends his sister was going to be the next Steve Jobs. But that enthusiasm came with expectations. They assumed my transition from employee to entrepreneur would be seamless, that my corporate salary would simply transform into even bigger profits. They didn't understand that starting a business meant taking 3 giant steps backward before taking 1 step forward. They didn't grasp that leaving my stable job meant leaving my stable income, my health insurance, my predictable life. The first crack appeared when I gave my notice at the corporate job. I had saved enough money for 6 months of expenses, found a brilliant co-founder in my former colleague James, and developed a solid business plan for our healthcare technology platform. We were going to revolutionize how patients and doctors communicated, making healthcare more accessible and efficient. I was 33, confident, and ready to bet everything on my vision. At my farewell party, thrown by my family at our usual Sunday gathering, the mood was celebratory but tinged with nervous energy. I could see the questions in their eyes, the subtle concerns they weren't yet ready to voice. When I mentioned that it might take a year or 2 to see significant profits, that I'd be living lean while we built the company, I noticed the first flickers of doubt crossed their faces. Dad asked pointed questions about my timeline, about when I expected to match my previous salary. Mom wondered aloud why I couldn't just develop my app as a side project while keeping my corporate job. Miguel suggested I might want to have a backup plan, maybe keep 1 foot in the corporate world. Carmen worried about my health insurance, about what would happen if I got sick. Diego, ever the youngest and most honest, simply asked if I was sure I wasn't making a huge mistake. I brushed off their concerns with the confidence of someone who had never truly failed at anything. I had excelled in school, succeeded in my corporate career, and saved money responsibly. How hard could entrepreneurship be? I assured them that within 18 months, they'd be proud of their risk-taking daughter who had built something meaningful from scratch. But as the weeks turned into months, and the initial excitement of launching our startup gave way to the grinding reality of building a business, I began to understand that my family's support was more fragile than I had imagined. The foundation of our relationship, built on shared success and financial stability, was about to be tested in ways none of us had anticipated. The first year of running my startup was like learning to swim by being thrown into the deep end of an Olympic pool. James and I worked 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and determination. trying to develop our healthcare platform while simultaneously learning how to pitch investors, manage finances, and navigate the complex world of medical technology regulations. Every small victory was followed by 3 setbacks. Every promising lead turned into another rejection. And every month that passed without significant revenue was another month closer to financial disaster. By month 8, my savings were nearly depleted. I had moved from my comfortable 1-bedroom apartment to a studio that barely fit my bed and desk. I sold my car and relied on public transportation and ride-sharing when absolutely necessary. My wardrobe consisted of the same 3 outfits I rotated for video calls with potential investors. And my diet had been reduced to whatever was cheapest at the grocery store. The woman who used to treat her family to nice dinners was now calculating whether she could afford both groceries and rent. What hurt more than the financial strain was watching my family's attitude shift with each passing month. The enthusiastic questions about my progress became less frequent, then politely concerned, then uncomfortable, and finally non-existent. When I called my parents' house for our usual weekly check-in, conversations that used to last an hour were suddenly wrapped up in 15 minutes. Mom would ask brief, surface-level questions about my health and then quickly pivot to talking about Carmen's new position at the hospital or Miguel's latest construction project. The Sunday family dinners that had been the cornerstone of our relationship became increasingly awkward. I would arrive with a small contribution to the meal, something I could afford, while my siblings brought wine, desserts, and gifts for Mom and Dad. The conversations would flow around me, focusing on everyone else's stable careers, their mortgages, their vacation plans, their children's activities. When someone occasionally asked about my business, I would try to stay positive, mentioning small wins like a promising investor meeting or a positive user feedback. But I could see the doubt in their eyes growing stronger with each month I remained unsuccessful. The shift was subtle at first, then undeniable. Miguel stopped asking about my progress entirely, instead focusing his attention on Dad and their construction projects. Carmen would give me sympathetic looks but quickly change the subject when business came up, as if discussing my failures might be contagious. Diego began making comments about the importance of financial security, about how some dreams were worth pursuing but only if you could afford them. Dad, who had once been my biggest cheerleader, became quietly disapproving. He had built his construction business through steady, incremental growth, never taking risks he couldn't afford. My approach, betting everything on an unproven idea, went against every instinct he had developed over 30 years of business ownership. He began making subtle suggestions about returning to corporate work, about being practical, about not being too proud to admit when something wasn't working. Mom, always the peacekeeper, tried to remain supportive, but I could feel her worry radiating every time she looked at me. She would pack extra food for me to take home, insisting she had made too much, but we both knew she was concerned about whether I was eating enough. Her questions became focused on my health, my stress levels, whether I was taking care of myself, rather than showing interest in what I was actually building. The most painful part was realizing that my struggles were becoming an embarrassment to them. When extended family asked about me, I overheard conversations where my parents would give vague answers about me working on a project or exploring new opportunities. The daughter they used to brag about had become the family member they preferred not to discuss in detail. Phone calls from my siblings became rare, then practically not. When I reached out to them, looking for emotional support rather than financial help, their responses were polite but distant. Miguel was always busy with work. Carmen was exhausted from her nursing shifts. Diego was focused on his studies. Everyone had reasons why they couldn't talk, couldn't meet for coffee, couldn't provide the simple comfort of family connection during the most challenging period of my life. The isolation crept in slowly, then all at once. I began to dread family gatherings because I felt like a charity case, the struggling relative everyone pitied but no longer respected. I started making excuses to skip Sunday dinners, claiming I was too busy with work, when the truth was I couldn't bear seeing the disappointment in their eyes, or feeling like the family failure who couldn't get her life together. By the end of the first year, I realized that my family's love and support had been conditional in ways I had never understood. When I was successful and financially stable, I was the accomplished daughter, the smart sister, the family success story. But when I was struggling, taking risks, and building something from nothing, I became an uncomfortable reminder of what happened when someone strayed too far from the safe, traditional path. The silence that had begun as brief Awkward pauses in conversation had expanded into long stretches where we barely communicated at all. I was learning, in the most painful way possible, that some relationships can only survive when everything is going well. Month 14 of my entrepreneurial journey brought me to a place I had never imagined I would find myself. I was behind on rent for the second consecutive month, living on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, and staring at a bank account that showed a balance of $37.53. The healthcare platform that James and I had poured our hearts into was still months away from generating meaningful revenue, and every investor pitch seemed to end with the same polite rejection. We love the concept, but the market timing isn't right, or come back when you have more user traction. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when James walked into our shared workspace, which was really just a converted garage we rented for $200 a month, and announced that he was taking a position with an established tech company. He had a wife and a newborn daughter, and the financial uncertainty had become unbearable for his family. He apologized, genuinely and repeatedly, but explained that he couldn't continue to risk his family's security for a dream that might never materialize. I understood his decision intellectually, but emotionally, it felt like the final piece of my world crumbling away. James wasn't just my business partner. He was the only person who truly understood what we were trying to build, who believed in the vision as much as I did. With him gone, I was completely alone with a half-finished product, mounting debt, and no clear path forward. That evening, sitting in my studio apartment as rain pelted against the single window, I made the phone calls I had been avoiding for months. I swallowed my pride and reached out to my family, not for money, but for something even more precious: emotional support, encouragement, someone to tell me that everything would be okay, that they believed in me even when I was struggling to believe in myself. I called Dad first, knowing that if anyone would understand the challenges of building a business, it would be him. The conversation started normally enough, with pleasantries about his health and Mom's garden, but when I began to explain how difficult things had become, how isolated I felt, how much I needed just to hear that someone in my family still had faith in me, his response cut deeper than any investor rejection. He told me, in the patient but firm tone he used when he thought I was being unreasonable, that maybe it was time to be realistic about my situation. He said that entrepreneurship wasn't for everyone, that there was no shame in admitting that I had given it my best shot but that it wasn't working out. He suggested that I start looking for corporate positions immediately, that the longer I stayed out of the traditional workforce, the harder it would be to get back in. The conversation ended with him saying he hoped I would make the smart choice and get my life back on track. My call to Miguel was even shorter. He listened to my explanation of James leaving and my financial situation with what felt like impatience, then told me he was busy with a big project and couldn't really talk. When I pressed, asking if we could meet for coffee sometime just to spend time together, he said he was swamped for the next few weeks but would try to call me back. He never did. Carmen's response was the most painful because it came wrapped in sisterly concern that felt more like pity than support. She told me she was worried about my mental health, that this level of stress wasn't good for me, that maybe I should consider seeing a therapist to help process my feelings about letting go of my business dreams. When I tried to explain that I wasn't ready to give up, that I just needed encouragement to keep going, she said she loved me but couldn't support decisions that were clearly harming me. Diego, my youngest brother who had always looked up to me, was the most honest in his rejection. He told me that watching me struggle had been hard for the whole family, that Mom cried about my situation, that Dad felt like I was throwing away everything they had worked to give me. He said that my pursuing this impossible dream was selfish, because it was hurting everyone who cared about me after those phone calls. I sat in the dark of my tiny apartment and felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The family I had counted on, the people who had raised me to believe I could accomplish anything, had essentially told me that my dreams were worthless, that my struggles were embarrassing, and that my determination was selfish. They wanted me to give up not because they believed I would fail, but because my failure was uncomfortable for them to witness. I spent the next 3 days in bed. Not from illness but from a kind of emotional exhaustion I had never experienced. Every motivational thought was immediately countered by the voices of my family members telling me to be realistic, to give up, to stop embarrassing myself and them. I questioned everything: my intelligence, my judgment, my worth as a person. If the people who knew me best thought I was deluding myself, maybe they were right. The rent notice that arrived on Thursday threatening eviction if I didn't pay within 5 days, forced me to face a brutal reality. I had exactly enough money for either rent or food for the rest of the month, but not both. I chose rent, figuring I could find creative ways to eat, maybe visit food banks or rely on the kindness of acquaintances I hadn't yet exhausted with my financial struggles. But even more devastating than the financial crisis was the emotional revelation that my family's love had been conditional all along. They loved the successful version of me, the version that validated their sacrifices and made them proud, the struggling version, the version that was taking risks and fighting for something meaningful, was an embarrassment they preferred to ignore. Rock bottom, I realized, wasn't just about money or business failure. It was about discovering that the people you thought would stand by you no matter what actually had very specific conditions for their support. Conditions you didn't even know existed until you failed to meet them. Thanksgiving arrived like a punch to the gut. A painful reminder of everything I had lost in the past year and a half. For 35 years, Thanksgiving had meant driving to my parents' house, walking into a kitchen filled with the scent of turkey and Mom's traditional Mexican sides, and spending the day surrounded by the chaos and warmth of family. This year, for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't invited. The exclusion wasn't delivered as a cruel ultimatum or a dramatic confrontation. Instead, it came in the form of silence, of conversations happening around me rather than with me, of plans being made without considering whether I might want to participate. When Carmen posted photos on social media of her shopping for Thanksgiving ingredients with Mom, I realized that the family dinner was still happening. I just wasn't part of it anymore. I told myself it was probably for the best. I couldn't afford to bring a dish that would meet Mom's standards. And I wasn't sure I could handle a day of pitying looks and awkward conversations about my continuing business struggles. But knowing something logically and feeling it emotionally are two entirely different experiences. On Thanksgiving morning, I woke up in my studio apartment to the sound of other families laughing in the hallway as they prepared for their celebrations, and I felt a loneliness so profound it was physically painful. I spent the day trying to distract myself with work, telling myself that I could use the quiet time to make progress on my platform. But every few minutes, I found myself imagining what was happening at Mom and Dad's house. Miguel would be watching football with Dad, probably complaining about his fantasy team. Carmen would be helping Mom in the kitchen, gossiping about her coworkers and her kids' latest achievements. Diego would be charming everyone with stories from school, making everyone laugh with his impressions of his professors. And I would be the empty chair at the table, the family member they were probably relieved not to have to worry about. The struggling sister who would have brought down the mood with her financial problems and unrealistic dreams. The social media photos began appearing in the evening, and each one felt like a small knife to my heart. There was the family gathered around the beautifully set table, everyone smiling and raising their glasses in a toast. There was Dad carving the turkey with his traditional theatrical flair. There was Mom beaming as she presented her famous flan, surrounded by children and grandchildren I rarely got to see anymore. There were my siblings with their arms around each other, looking like the close, successful family I had once been. Part of in every photo, there was a space where I should have been. A gap that they had apparently learned to overlook. Christmas was somehow even worse. I had managed to scrape together enough money for small gifts. Nothing expensive but thoughtful items I had chosen carefully for each family member. I wrapped them in brown paper bags decorated with drawings, trying to make poverty look artistic rather than desperate. But when I called Mom to ask about Christmas plans, she gave me the same vague responses I had been receiving for months. She said they were keeping things simple this year. Just immediate family, nothing fancy. When I asked if that included me, since I was immediate family, there was a pause that lasted forever before she said that maybe it would be better if I focused on getting my life together rather than worrying about holidays. She suggested that I use the time to send out resumes or work on my business, that maybe next year when things were more stable, we could all celebrate together properly. The message was clear. My presence would be a reminder of failure, a dampener on their holiday joy. I was being excluded, not out of cruelty, but out of a desire to protect the family's happiness from my struggles. Christmas Day. I walked through my neighborhood and looked into the windows of houses where families were gathered around trees, opening presents, sharing meals, creating memories. I felt like a ghost, invisible and forgotten, watching life happen to everyone except me. The gifts I had bought for my family sat on my tiny table, wrapped and labeled, with nowhere to go. The hardest part wasn't the loneliness itself, though that was devastating. The hardest part was understanding that my family had made a conscious choice to exclude me, that they had decided their comfort was more important than my belonging. They weren't cruel people, and they probably told themselves they were protecting me from awkward situations or giving me space to figure things out. But the effect was the same. I had been erased from the family narrative during the time I needed them most. New Year's Eve brought a strange kind of clarity. As I sat alone in my apartment, watching fireworks through my window and listening to celebrations happening all around me, I made a resolution that had nothing to do with business success or financial goals. I resolved to remember this feeling, this profound isolation, this understanding of what it meant to be abandoned by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. I resolved to remember how it felt to be judged worthy of love only when everything in your life was going perfectly, and how quickly that love could disappear when you needed it most. I resolved to never make another person feel the way my family had made me feel during the loneliest holidays of my life. But I also resolved something else, something that would sustain me through the dark months ahead. I resolved to prove to myself, if to no one else, that their lack of faith in me was their failure, not mine. I resolved to build something meaningful, not for their approval, but despite their abandonment. The holidays had taught me that family wasn't always about blood, and that love wasn't always about loyalty. Sometimes the people who should stand by you are the first ones to walk away, and sometimes you have to learn to be your own source of strength when everyone else's strength fails you. As the calendar turned to a new year, I understood that I was completely alone in ways I had never been before, but I also understood that being alone and being defeated were two different things. And I wasn't ready to be defeated yet. When you're drowning, sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. While my biological family had retreated from my life like I was contagious with failure, 3 people emerged who would teach me what unconditional support actually looked like. The first was Mrs. Chen, my 70-year-old neighbor who lived in the apartment next to mine. I had barely spoken to her beyond polite hallway greetings until the day she knocked on my door holding a container of homemade soup. She had noticed that I looked thinner, she said in her gentle, accented English, and wanted to make sure I was eating properly. When I tried to politely decline, explaining that I was fine, she gave me a look that could see straight through to my soul and said that lying about being hungry was foolish pride. And foolish pride never filled an empty stomach. Mrs. Chen had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1970s with her husband, who had passed away 5 years earlier. She understood what it meant to start over with nothing, to face a world that didn't believe in your dreams, to feel alone in a country that sometimes felt foreign even after decades. She began leaving containers of food outside my door, never asking for thanks or explanations, just ensuring that I had one good meal each day. More importantly, she became someone I could talk to without judgment. In the evenings, when the loneliness felt unbearable, I would sit with her on the building's small patio, and she would listen to my fears and frustrations without trying to fix them or tell me to give up. She would share stories of her own struggles, of times when she had wanted to quit but found reasons to continue. She never pretended my situation wasn't difficult, but she also never suggested that difficulty meant I should surrender. The second unexpected angel was Marcus, a former colleague from my corporate days, who reached out after hearing through mutual connections that I was struggling. Marcus had left the same company 2 years before me to start his own consulting firm, and while his business was successful now, he remembered the terror and isolation of those early months. He offered something invaluable, professional advice, from someone who had walked the same path. Marcus met with me once a week at a coffee shop, buying my coffee and treating our meetings like the business consultations they were. He helped me refine my pitch, introduced me to contacts in his network, and most importantly, reminded me that struggling didn't mean failing. He had been where I was, had felt the same doubts and fears, and had found a way through. His success wasn't just inspiring, it was proof that my dreams weren't impossible. But Marcus offered more than business advice. He offered validation that my choice to leave corporate security wasn't insane, that entrepreneurship was a legitimate path even when it was terrifying, and that the people who didn't understand my journey weren't necessarily smarter or more practical than I was. He had faced the same skepticism from family and friends, the same pressure to give up and return to traditional employment, and he had learned to trust his own judgment over other people's fears. The third person who showed up when I needed it most was Dr. Patricia Williams, a mentor I had met briefly at a conference years earlier. When I sent her a LinkedIn message explaining my situation and asking for advice, I expected either no response or a polite brush-off. Instead, she called me within 2 days and invited me to lunch. Dr. Williams was in her 50s, a successful entrepreneur who had built and sold 2 companies and now spent her time mentoring other women in tech. She had heard my story and recognized something in my struggle that reminded her of her own journey. Over lunch, she told me that she had nearly given up on her first company 3 times, that her family had thought she was crazy, and that the loneliness of entrepreneurship had almost broken her. But she also told me something that changed my perspective entirely. She said that the people who succeed as entrepreneurs aren't necessarily the smartest or the most talented. They're the ones who can endure uncertainty and isolation long enough to build something meaningful. She said that my family's lack of support wasn't a reflection of my potential. It was a reflection of their inability to understand a path they had never walked themselves. Dr. Williams became more than a mentor. She became a chosen family member. She checked in on me regularly, celebrated small victories that no one else understood, and provided the encouragement I couldn't find anywhere else. When I doubted myself, she reminded me of my strengths. When I felt like giving up, she shared stories of other entrepreneurs who had faced similar challenges and emerged successful. These 3 people created a safety net that caught me when my biological family let me fall. Mrs. Chen fed my body. Marcus guided my business decisions, and Dr. Williams nourished my spirit. Together, they formed a chosen family that supported me not because of obligation or blood relations, but because they recognized something worthwhile in my struggle and wanted to help me succeed. They taught me that family isn't always about who raised you or who shares your DNA. Sometimes family is about who shows up when you need them most, who believes in you when you can barely believe in yourself, and who stands by you not because they have to, but because they choose to. The contrast between their unconditional support and my biological family's conditional love was stark and painful, but also illuminating. I began to understand that love isn't about convenience or comfort. It's about choosing to care for someone, even when caring is difficult, even when their struggles make you uncomfortable, even when their dreams seem impossible. Mrs. Chen, Marcus, and Dr. Williams didn't just help me survive the darkest period of my entrepreneurial journey. They showed me what authentic relationships looked like, what it meant to be valued for who you were rather than what you had accomplished, and what it felt like to be part of a family that actually functioned the way families are supposed to function. They gave me something my biological family couldn't: the confidence to keep going. Not because success was guaranteed, but because I was worthy of support, regardless of the outcome. Month 26 of my entrepreneurial journey brought the kind of phone call that changes everything. I was sitting in the same converted garage where James and I had once dreamed together, now working alone but with a clearer vision than ever before. When Dr. Amanda Rodriguez from Houston Methodist Hospital called to discuss our healthcare platform. Dr. Rodriguez had been introduced to me through Dr. Williams' network, and she had been testing our platform with a small group of patients for 3 months. The call I expected to be a polite rejection turned into something I had been waiting for over 2 years to hear. She wanted to discuss implementing our system hospital-wide, potentially affecting thousands of patients and dozens of healthcare providers. The validation was overwhelming. After months of rejection, of people telling me the market wasn't ready, that the technology was too complex, that healthcare institutions were too resistant to change, here was a respected physician telling me that our platform was exactly what her patients needed. She described how our communication tools had improved patient compliance, reduced emergency room visits, and created better relationships between patients and their care teams. But more than the professional validation, Dr. Rodriguez's enthusiasm reminded me why I had started this journey in the first place. I wasn't building technology for technology's sake. I was solving real problems for real people. The long nights, the financial struggles, the isolation, all of it had been leading to this moment when someone could tell me that our work was making people's lives better. The contract negotiation took 3 weeks, during which I barely slept. Working with lawyers, I could barely afford to review terms and conditions that would determine the future of my company. The final agreement was for a 2-year implementation worth $400,000, with potential for expansion to other hospitals in the Houston Methodist system. When I signed the contract, sitting in a conference room that cost more per hour than I spent on food in a month, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: financial security. Not wealth, not luxury, but the simple relief of knowing I could pay rent, buy groceries, and invest in growing the business without constantly calculating whether I could afford basic necessities. The first thing I did was call Mrs. Chen, invite her to dinner at a real restaurant, not because I needed to celebrate with someone, but because I wanted to thank the person who had kept me fed when I couldn't feed myself. We went to a small Italian place where she ordered wine and told me stories about her late husband's business struggles, how he had nearly given up on his import company multiple times before finding success. The second call was to Marcus, who had been tracking my progress through our weekly meetings and knew how close I had come to giving up. His excitement was genuine and immediate, and he insisted on taking me out for drinks to celebrate. More importantly, he helped me understand that this contract was just the beginning, that I needed to start thinking about scaling, about hiring, about turning one success into sustainable growth. Dr. Williams' reaction was perhaps the most meaningful. When I called to tell her about the Houston Methodist contract, she was quiet for a long moment before saying that she had known this day would come, that she had seen something in my determination that reminded her of her own breakthrough moment. Years earlier, she helped me understand that success wasn't just about the money or the validation. It was about proving to myself that I could endure uncertainty long enough to build something meaningful. But the most profound change wasn't in my bank account or my business prospects, it was in my relationship with myself. For over 2 years, I had been carrying the weight of other people's doubt, questioning my judgment, wondering if everyone who told me to give up was right. The Houston Methodist contract didn't just validate my business idea, it validated my decision to trust my own vision even when everyone else thought I was delusional. I began to understand that entrepreneurship wasn't just about building a company, it was about building the confidence to bet on yourself when no one else will. It was about learning to distinguish between wise caution and paralyzing fear, between realistic assessment and other people's projections of their own limitations. The financial breathing room allowed me to make strategic decisions rather than desperate ones. I could hire a part-time developer to help expand the platform's capabilities. I could invest in better marketing materials and attend industry conferences where I could meet other potential clients. I could move from my studio apartment to a one-bedroom place with actual space to work and think. But perhaps most importantly, I could finally see the path forward. The Houston Methodist contract wasn't just a business victory, it was proof of concept that other hospitals would find compelling. Dr. Rodriguez had already begun introducing me to colleagues at other medical institutions, and the conversations that had once been polite brush-offs were now genuine discussions about implementation timelines and customization needs. Word began to spread through the healthcare technology community that there was a small company in Austin solving real communication problems between patients and providers. The phone calls that had once been rejections became exploratory conversations. The investors who had once seen my platform as too niche began to understand the market potential. 6 months after signing the Houston Methodist contract, I had contracts with 3 additional hospitals and had hired 2 full-time employees. The business was still small, still growing, still requiring long hours and careful financial management, but it was no longer a desperate struggle for survival. It was a real company providing real value to real people. The breakthrough had come not from changing my vision or compromising my standards, but from persisting long enough for the right opportunity to recognize the value I had been building. All along, all the people who had told me to be realistic, to give up, to get a traditional job, had been wrong not because they were cruel, but because they couldn't see what I could see. Success, I learned, wasn't about being the smartest person in the room or having the most resources or the best connections. Success was about having the courage to continue building something meaningful even when everyone around you thought you were wasting your time. Even when you sometimes thought you were wasting your time yourself. The woman who had eaten ramen noodles for dinner while working 18-hour days was the same woman who was now signing contracts and hiring employees. The difference wasn't in my abilities or my circumstances. The difference was in my willingness to endure uncertainty long enough for opportunity to find me. 3 years after the Houston Methodist breakthrough, my healthcare communication platform had grown into something I had barely dared to imagine during those desperate early days. We were working with 47 hospitals across 12 states, had a team of 23 employees, and were processing over 2 million patient communications annually. What had started as a desperate attempt to solve a problem I had observed during my own healthcare experiences had evolved into a company that was genuinely improving how patients and providers connected. The decision to go public wasn't one I made lightly. For months, investment bankers had been calling, explaining that our growth trajectory and market position made us an attractive candidate for an initial public offering. The healthcare technology sector was hot, they said, and investors were eager to support companies that could demonstrate both social impact and financial returns. But going public meant more than just raising capital. It meant opening our private company to public scrutiny, transforming from a small business where I knew every employee's name to a corporation with shareholders, quarterly earnings reports, and regulatory compliance requirements. It meant trading the intimacy and flexibility of a private company for the resources and credibility of being publicly traded. The IPO process itself was exhausting and exhilarating. Months of due diligence, legal reviews, financial audits, and investor presentations culminated in a roadshow where I found myself in conference rooms across the country, explaining our vision to institutional investors who would determine our company's market value. The woman who had once struggled to afford coffee was now presenting 2 pension funds and hedge funds that managed billions of dollars. On the morning of our IPO, I stood on the floor of the NASDAQ exchange in New York, surrounded by our employees, investors, and the investment banking team that had guided us through the process. When I rang the opening bell to begin trading of our stock, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment: the ramen noodle dinners, the rejected investor pitches, the family gatherings I hadn't been invited to, the loneliness that had almost broken me. Our stock opened at $18 per share and closed the first day at $29, valuing the company at over $200 million. My personal stake, built from years of sacrifice and reinvestment, was suddenly worth $37 million. I had become, at least on paper, the kind of successful entrepreneur that business magazines write about and that my family had once assured me I could never become. The news spread quickly through our industry and back to Austin, where local media picked up the story of the hometown tech company that had gone from garage startup to public corporation. Within hours of the market close, my phone was buzzing with notifications from news alerts, LinkedIn messages, and social media posts celebrating our success. But the most surreal part wasn't seeing our stock ticker scroll across financial news networks or reading articles about our company in the Wall Street Journal. The most surreal part was watching people from my past emerge from years of silence as if they had been cheering for me all along. The first call came from Diego, my youngest brother, who hadn't spoken to me in over a year. His voice was bright with excitement as he congratulated me on the IPO, telling me how proud he was, how he had always known I would succeed, how he had been following my company's progress and bragging about his successful sister to his friends. The conversation felt like talking to a stranger who happened to know personal details about my life. Carmen called the next day, her tone warm and sisterly in a way I hadn't heard since before I left my corporate job. She wanted to know all about the IPO process, about what it felt like to ring the opening bell, about my plans for the future. She mentioned that she had seen the news coverage and had been so excited she had called Mom immediately to share the good news. The sister who had once told me I needed therapy to let go of my impossible dreams was now asking if I could give her career advice. Miguel's call was perhaps the most jarring. He opened by saying he had always believed in my vision, that he had been rooting for me even during the difficult years when we hadn't talked much. He said the family had been following my progress and were all incredibly proud of what I had accomplished. The revisionist history was so complete, so seamlessly delivered, that I almost wondered if I had imagined the years of silence and judgment. Dad's call came a week later, after he had presumably processed the full magnitude of what had happened. His voice carried a mix of pride and something that sounded almost like awe as he told me that he had underestimated my business instincts, that he now understood I had inherited more of his entrepreneurial spirit than he had realized. He wanted to know if I would be interested in having lunch to discuss some business ideas he had been thinking about, opportunities where my success and his experience might create synergies. Mom's approach was different but equally transparent. Rather than calling directly, she began posting on social media about her successful daughter, sharing articles about the IPO and adding comments about how proud the family was, how they had always supported my dreams, how wonderful it was to see hard work and determination pay off. The woman who had suggested I skip family holidays to focus on getting my life together was now presenting herself as the supportive mother who had always believed in her daughter's potential. The transformation was complete and instantaneous. Overnight, I had gone from being the family embarrassment to being the family success story. The same relatives who had avoided me during my struggles were now eager to reconnect, to be associated with my achievement, to claim their place in the narrative of my triumph. Extended family members I hadn't heard from in years sent Facebook messages and text messages congratulating me on my success. Cousins wanted to know if I would be interested in investing in their business ideas. Aunts and uncles who had once given me pitying looks at family gatherings were now posting about their successful niece and asking if I could speak to their children about entrepreneurship. The most revealing moment came when Carmen mentioned, almost casually, that the family was planning a celebration dinner in my honor. That they wanted to gather everyone together to properly acknowledge my achievement. The same people who had excluded me from Thanksgiving and Christmas when I was struggling now wanted to throw a party to celebrate my success. Standing in my new apartment, looking out at the Austin skyline while fielding congratulatory calls from family members who had been absent for years, I felt a complex mix of emotions. There was satisfaction in proving wrong everyone who had doubted me, but there was also a profound sadness in understanding how shallow their support had always been. Success, I realized, had indeed revealed people's true intentions. But the revelation wasn't what I had expected. It wasn't that my family was cruel or malicious. It was that their love was fundamentally conditional, based on my ability to make them proud rather than on who I was as a person. They loved the successful version of me because that version reflected well on them, validated their choices, and made them feel good about themselves. The IPO had given me financial freedom, professional recognition, and the satisfaction of building something meaningful, but it had also given me perfect clarity about the difference between people who love you for who you are, and people who love you for what you can do for them. 3 months after the IPO, the invitation arrived via text message from Carmen, complete, with a heart emoji and multiple exclamation points. The Martinez family was throwing a celebration dinner in my honor at Pepito, the upscale seafood restaurant where we used to go for special occasions when I was growing up. Everyone would be there, she said, including extended family members who were eager to congratulate me on my incredible success. The restaurant was exactly as I remembered it. Warm lighting, the sound of laughter and conversation mixing with soft jazz, and the smell of butter and seafood that had marked every important family celebration of my childhood. As I walked through the dining room toward our reserved section, I felt like I was stepping back into a life I had left behind years ago. They were all there, exactly as Carmen had promised. Mom and Dad sat at the head of the large table, beaming with pride as they spotted me approaching. Miguel and his wife Sofia were already deep in conversation with Aunt Rosa and Uncle Carlos. While Diego was showing photos on his phone to my teenage cousins, Carmen had positioned herself near the entrance, clearly appointed as the evening's hostess and coordinator. The greeting I received was unlike anything I had experienced from my family in over 4 years. Dad stood up and embraced me with the kind of warm, lingering hug he used to give me when I was a child and had accomplished something that made him proud. Mom had tears in her eyes as she held my face in her hands and told me how beautiful I looked, how successful and confident I appeared. Carmen introduced me to the extended family members as if I were a celebrity, emphasizing my achievements and the company's valuation with the kind of detail that suggested she had been following my progress obsessively. The conversation throughout dinner was a masterclass in selective memory and revisionist history. Miguel regaled the table with stories about my childhood determination, presenting my early entrepreneurial traits as evidence that he had always known I would build a successful business. Carmen shared anecdotes about my college years, emphasizing my academic achievements and my early interest in technology as if they were clear predictors of my eventual success. Dad took credit for inspiring my business instincts, telling the table about how he had taught me to think like an entrepreneur, to see opportunities where others saw problems. Mom nodded along, adding that she had always encouraged my independence and creativity, that she had known I was destined for something special. Diego, now 25 and working in marketing, asked thoughtful questions about scaling a business and managing growth as if our relationship had always been one of mutual respect and regular communication. The most surreal aspect of the evening was how seamlessly everyone had integrated my success into the family narrative. According to the stories being told around that table, I had always been the ambitious daughter who was destined for greatness, supported by a loving family who had never doubted my potential. The years of silence, the exclusion from holidays, the suggestions that I give up and get a traditional job, all of it had been erased from the collective memory as if it had never happened. Uncle Carlos, who had barely acknowledged my existence during my struggling years, now wanted to discuss investment opportunities, mentioning that he had some money saved and was looking for ways to diversify his portfolio. Aunt Rosa asked if I would be willing to speak to her daughter about entrepreneurship, explaining that young women needed role models like me to show them what was possible. Cousin Patricia, who worked in healthcare administration, wondered if there might be opportunities for collaboration between my company and her hospital system. As the evening progressed, the conversation naturally turned to family plans and future gatherings. Mom mentioned that they were thinking about planning a family vacation. Maybe renting a house somewhere beautiful where we could all spend time together and properly celebrate my success. Carmen suggested that I might want to host Christmas at my new place, since I now had the space and resources to accommodate everyone comfortably. The assumption that I would seamlessly reintegrate into family life, that I would be grateful for their renewed attention and eager to share my success with them, was so complete that questioning it seemed almost rude. They had convinced themselves that this celebration dinner was a natural continuation of our relationship rather than an attempt to reconnect after years of estrangement. But the most revealing moment came when Dad raised his glass for a toast, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used when making important pronouncements. He spoke about family loyalty, about how blood relations always endure even when life takes us in different directions, about how proud he was that his daughter had achieved such remarkable success. He talked about the sacrifices he and Mom had made to give their children opportunities, and how my achievement validated all of their hard work and faith. As I listened to his words, surrounded by the smiling faces of relatives who were raising their glasses in my honor, I felt a strange disconnection from the scene. These people were celebrating someone who shared my name and my achievements, but they weren't celebrating me. They were celebrating the version of me that made them feel good about themselves, that reflected positively on their family, that transformed their immigrant's success story into something even more impressive. The woman who had eaten ramen noodles alone while they celebrated holidays without her, who had struggled through the darkest period of her life without their support, who had built something meaningful despite their lack of faith. That woman wasn't at this table. That woman had been inconvenient, embarrassing, a reminder that taking risks sometimes meant failing. This successful woman, however, was someone they were eager to claim, to be associated with, to incorporate into their family mythology after dinner. As we stood in the restaurant's parking lot saying our goodbyes, family members made plans for future gatherings and exchanged promises to stay in better touch. Carmen hugged me and said she was so happy to have her sister back, that the family felt complete again now that I was successful and could join their celebrations. Miguel mentioned that he would love to have lunch soon to discuss some business ideas he had been considering. Diego asked if I would be his mentor as he thought about starting his own company. Driving home that night, I reflected on the evening's strangeness. The celebration had been warm, loving, and genuine in its own way. My family's pride in my success was real, their joy at my achievement was authentic, and their desire to reconnect was sincere. But it was all contingent on my success, conditional on my ability to make them proud, dependent on my transformation from struggling entrepreneur to successful businesswoman. They loved me, but they loved me conditionally. They supported me, but only when support was easy and comfortable. They wanted to be part of my life, but only when my life reflected well on theirs. The celebration dinner wasn't really about celebrating me, it was about celebrating the fact that I had finally become someone they could be proud to claim as family. The realization wasn't bitter or angry, just clear. I understood now that some relationships can only exist under certain conditions, that some love can only survive when life is going well, and that some families can only function when everyone is playing their assigned role in the success story. They had revealed their true intentions, exactly as I had learned success would do, but the revelation wasn't what I had expected, and my response wouldn't be what they expected either. 2 weeks after the celebration dinner, Carmen called to invite me to Sunday brunch at Mom and Dad's house, the kind of casual family gathering that had once been the cornerstone of our relationships. She mentioned that everyone was excited to spend more time with me, to hear about my plans for the company, and to properly welcome me back into the family routine. I accepted the invitation, but not for the reasons Carmen imagined. I had spent 2 weeks processing the celebration dinner, thinking about the years of silence and the sudden enthusiasm, and I had come to a decision about how I wanted to move forward with my family. The conversation I needed to have couldn't happen over text messages or phone calls. It required looking them in the eyes and speaking my truth clearly. The scene at my parents' house was exactly what I expected, warm, welcoming, and completely comfortable with the new version of our relationship. Mom had prepared my favorite breakfast items. Dad was eager to discuss business strategies, and my siblings were full of questions about my company's future plans. The atmosphere was relaxed and happy, as if the past 4 years of estrangement had been a minor interruption rather than a fundamental rupture. About an hour into the visit, as we sat around the familiar kitchen table where I had eaten thousands of meals growing up, I asked if we could talk about something important. The conversation stopped, and everyone turned their attention to me with the kind of focused interest that successful people receive when they have something to say. I began by acknowledging how wonderful it was to see everyone again, how much I had missed being part of family gatherings, and how genuinely happy I was that they were proud of my achievements. But then I told them that I needed to address something that had been weighing on me since the celebration dinner, something about the years between my leaving corporate work and the IPO success. The shift in the room's energy was immediate and uncomfortable. Dad's expression became cautious, Mom started fidgeting with her napkin, and my siblings exchanged glances that suggested they knew this conversation might not go the direction they had hoped. I told them about the holidays I had spent alone, about the phone calls that went unreturned, about the suggestions that I give up and get a traditional job. I described the loneliness of building something meaningful while feeling like my own family was embarrassed by my struggles and disappointed in my choices. I explained how painful it had been to realize that their love and support were conditional on my success, that I was worthy of inclusion only when I could make them proud. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Finally, Dad spoke, his voice defensive as he explained that they had been concerned about my well-being, that watching me struggle had been difficult for them too. He said they had thought giving me space was kinder than constantly worrying about my situation, that they hadn't wanted to add pressure by asking questions about my business when it was clearly not going well. Mom's response was tearful as she insisted that they had never stopped loving me, that they had been praying for my success every day, that they simply hadn't known how to help someone who was determined to pursue such a risky path. She said they had been protecting themselves from watching me fail, not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much. Carmen's explanation was that the family had been afraid of saying the wrong thing, of accidentally discouraging me or making my situation worse by acknowledging how dire it seemed. She said they had thought staying away was better than being negative influences during such a critical time in my business development. Miguel and Diego remained largely silent, occasionally nodding along with our parents' explanations but not offering justifications of their own. The discomfort in the room was palpable as they realized that their warm welcome back into the family was being complicated by an examination of their behavior. During my absence, I listened to their explanations, with compassion but also with clarity. I told them that I understood their reasoning, that I didn't think they had been intentionally cruel, and that I believed they had convinced themselves they were acting in my best interests. But I also told them that impact mattered more than intention, that their absence during my most difficult period had taught me important lessons about conditional love and fair weather support. I explained that the celebration dinner, while wonderful in many ways, had felt strange because it seemed to erase the years when they hadn't wanted to celebrate with me, when my presence at family gatherings was seen as uncomfortable rather than welcome. I told them that their sudden enthusiasm for my success felt hollow, because it wasn't accompanied by any acknowledgement of how they had treated me during my struggles. The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. We talked about what family support actually means, about the difference between loving someone when it's easy and loving them when it's hard. We discussed how their definition of family loyalty had been tested by my entrepreneurial journey and had been found wanting. I told them that I didn't want an apology or an explanation that would make everyone feel better. What I wanted was honesty about what had happened and clarity about how we would move forward. I wanted them to understand that their love had been conditional, that their support had been dependent on my success, and that this knowledge would shape our relationship going forward. By the end of the conversation, we had reached an understanding that was truthful, if not entirely comfortable. They acknowledged that they had struggled to support a path they didn't understand, that they had prioritized their own comfort over my need for family connection, and that their recent enthusiasm was indeed related to my financial success rather than my personal growth. I told them that I was willing to rebuild our relationship, but it would be different than it had been before. I would no longer look to them for unconditional support or assume that family love meant family loyalty. I would engage with them as people I cared about, but not as people I depended on. As relatives I enjoyed spending time with, but not as my primary source of emotional support. The reckoning wasn't cruel or vindictive, but it was honest. I had learned too much about myself and about them to pretend that success could simply erase the years of abandonment. They had revealed their true intentions, and I had revealed mine. I would love them, but I would no longer need them in the way I once had. 6 months after the reckoning with my biological family, I hosted my first Thanksgiving in my new home, but the guest list looked nothing like the family gatherings of my childhood. Around my table sat Mrs. Chen, now 81, and still bringing homemade soup to neighbors who needed it. Marcus and his wife Jennifer, who had become close friends beyond our business relationship. Dr. Williams and her partner, Sarah, who had driven down from Dallas to celebrate with the chosen family. They had helped me understand was possible. There was also James, my former business partner, who had reached out after the IPO to congratulate me and apologize for leaving when the company was struggling. Our conversation had led to a rekindled friendship built on mutual understanding of the entrepreneurial journey's challenges. 3 of my employees joined us as well. People who had become family through shared purpose and mutual respect rather than shared DNA. The conversation around my Thanksgiving table was different from the family dinners of my youth. We talked about gratitude with the depth that comes from having survived real struggles together. We shared stories of failure and recovery, of dreams deferred and dreams achieved, of learning to distinguish between people who support you and people who simply benefit from your success. Mrs. Chen, sitting in the place of honor usually reserved for the family patriarch, told stories about building community with neighbors who had become closer than her distant relatives. Marcus shared his own journey of creating chosen family from business colleagues who had supported him through difficult transitions. Dr. Williams talked about the women entrepreneurs she mentored, how professional relationships had evolved into profound personal connections based on shared values and mutual support. The contrast with my biological family's conditional love was striking but not bitter. I had learned to appreciate what they could offer while accepting what they couldn't. We had settled into a relationship that was cordial and pleasant, built around shared memories and genuine affection, but no longer dependent on their approval or validation. I attended their gatherings when invited, brought thoughtful gifts, and maintained the kind of connection that honored our history without depending on their understanding of my choices. When Dad asked for business advice, I offered it generously. When Mom wanted to brag about my success to her friends, I let her. When my siblings needed recommendations or introductions, I provided them willingly, but I no longer looked to them for emotional support during difficult times. No longer expected them to understand my decisions, and no longer needed their pride to feel good about my achievements. I had learned the difference between family as obligation and family as choice. Between love as convenience and love as commitment, the business continued to grow, expanding into new markets and developing innovative solutions for healthcare communication challenges. But success felt different now that I understood the difference between achieving goals to prove something to others and achieving goals to fulfill your own vision. The validation I had once sought from my family, I now found in the meaningful work itself. In the patients whose lives were improved by our platform, in the healthcare providers who told us we were solving real problems. Mrs. Chen remained my most trusted advisor on matters of the heart, the person who reminded me that success without kindness was empty, that wealth without generosity was meaningless. Marcus became the brother I chose, the person who understood my professional challenges and celebrated my victories with genuine enthusiasm. Dr. Williams evolved into the mother figure I needed, someone who believed in my potential even when I struggled to believe in it myself. My chosen family grew to include other entrepreneurs who understood the loneliness of building something from nothing, healthcare professionals who shared our mission of improving patient outcomes, and neighbors who showed up not because they had to but because they wanted to. These relationships were built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of love that doesn't disappear when life gets complicated. The woman who had once eaten ramen noodles alone while excluded from family holidays now hosted gatherings where everyone was welcome, where success was celebrated but struggle was also honored, where love was offered without conditions or expectations. The platform I had built to improve communication between patients and healthcare providers had taught me how to improve communication in my own life, how to build relationships based on authenticity rather than convenience. Looking back on the journey from broke entrepreneur to successful business owner, the financial transformation was remarkable, but the personal transformation was profound. I had learned that family isn't always about who raised you. That support isn't always about sharing DNA. And that love isn't always about obligation. The people who showed up during my darkest period, who believed in me when I barely believed in myself, who offered help without expecting anything in return. Those people had taught me what unconditional love actually looked like. They had shown me that you can create a family based on choice rather than chance, based on shared values rather than shared genetics, based on mutual support rather than mutual convenience. Success had indeed revealed people's true intentions, exactly as I had learned it would, but it had also revealed my own capacity to choose who belonged in my life, to build relationships that sustained rather than drained me, and to love people not because I had to but because I wanted to. The broken woman who had once needed her family's approval to feel worthy had become a whole woman who could offer love without needing anything in return. And that transformation, more than any business success or financial achievement, was the real victory of my entrepreneurial journey. Has life ever led you to create a family outside of blood ties? I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts. In the comments, your stories matter. And if this journey touched something inside you, feel free to support the channel or pass this video along to someone who needs it.